My name is Maureen Lurch. I am the Library Director here at the University of Akron Wayne College Library. I'm also joined in the chat room with Lisa Nagy, who is our Public Services Librarian, so she'll be helping out by looking at the chat and also posting things in the chat, like a link to the LibGuide I'm going to show you in a moment. So welcome, Lisa, and thanks for your help today. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to celebrate Fair Use Week. It's one of those library weeks that a lot of people let come and go without paying it much attention. But Fair Use Week is a really fun event in library land because it celebrates the facets of fair use and copyrighted materials, which we deal with every day in the library. So we're always thinking about copyrighted materials and how you can use them in the classroom, for your research papers, all that stuff. Fair use is actually essential to our economy. It's essential to innovation, creativity, and to scholarship, so writing your research papers, all that good stuff. So it really does affect our daily lives. We just don't often think about it very much. Now, I will put this out here that I'm a librarian, okay? I am not a lawyer, and I'm most certainly not a copyright lawyer. So I may be talking about the law and fair use, but you really can't take any of this as legal advice, okay? All right. So, but before we get into fair use, we should start out at the very, very beginning and just talk about copyright. What is it? How does it affect us? Why is it there? Why do we care? And if you are seeing my screen that I've shared, I always start out at the Wayne College Library homepage. So right now you can see my screen, hopefully. And I'm going to go into a LibGuide that we've prepared on copyright, and we're going to use this as a guide for this presentation, but also know that you could always come back to this guide at a later date to either refresh what we've talked about or to walk through the framework, which I'm going to cover today. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to our LibGuides. This is a list of all the Wayne College LibGuides. And Lisa will be posting a direct link to this LibGuide, but all of our LibGuides are listed here. And I'm going to look at the Wayne College Topics Guides, okay, in the center of the page, and there's one that's listed for copyright. This will be our guide for the presentation today. Let's see here, we've got the main page, which we're going to be spending most of our time on today, and then there's also 2 additional tabs. You would be interested at some point to look at a place where you can find permissive media to use in your projects. And then there's some copyright scenarios if you ever wanted to really think deeply about copyright and how it might be used in the classroom or in your daily lives. But most of the time we're going to be starting out here with this main copyright LibGuide. And let's go ahead and look at this top corner here that talks about what is copyright. Okay? Now, copyright is a federal regulation. It's actually part of the United States Constitution. So back when our founding fathers were deciding how to run this country and how to develop public policy, they were thinking about copyright then. And it's a good thing they were, because they really did set in place a good system to help people with their creative works. So Congress is allowed to pass laws, and this is a quote from the Constitution, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing the limited times for authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Now that's a mouthful, I stumbled over it, but basically copyright is intended to incentivize people to create things. Okay, so when you own a copyright to something, that means that you own it, you have the right to benefit from it, but for a certain length of time. It also allows Congress to adopt both copyright laws and patent laws. So those are 2 separate things, but it's in the Constitution that allows Congress to write laws regarding copyright. It does create a financial incentive for authors and inventors to continue to contribute and create new works. Okay, so there is an economic incentive for people to create things and benefit from that. And then it also protects you. And it does require that the rights will expire at some point. It's not forever, okay? So for the length of the author's life, plus some years, that's how copyright works, okay? So the next part is to think about what are your copyrights. Okay, so as a creator, as a writer, as somebody who creates content or makes things, if you're an artist, if you're a writer, if you're a singer, you have rights. If you're a student, you have rights of the content that you create. And here are your rights under copyright law. You have the right to reproduce your copyrighted work in copies. So you can write a play and you can make all the photocopies you want. Okay, so you can make copies of your own created works. You are also allowed to prepare derivative works based on your copyrighted item. Now, that's not to be confused with something we're going to talk about in a little bit when we talk about fair use transformative works. But derivative works basically just means that you have the right to, if you write a book, you have the right to write the screenplay and then benefit from the screenplay or the movie. If you have, if you create a sculpture, you have the right to photograph that sculpture. Okay, so those derivative works, and if you wanted more definitions, you can always come to the guide and click on the hyperlink, and it will go into derivative works more in depth. But you have the right to create more things based on your original thing. Okay, you also have the right to distribute copies of the copyrighted work, which means nobody else can do that. You have the right to distribute or hand out copies. So not only can you make a copy of your screenplay, but you can also pass those copies out, and you can also sell them, okay? So those are your rights. You have the right to perform your copyrighted work publicly. So if you wrote a poem, you have the right to recite it out loud in a public space. You also have the right to display your copyrighted work. So if you create that sculpture, you have the right to put it in a foyer and let people look at it, okay? And then you also have the right to perform and by means of public distribution over audio transmission, which means like if you're doing a webinar like I'm doing today, if I wrote a poem, I would have a right to recite it for you right now, okay? I won't do that. I'll spare you, okay? So just in a nutshell, that's what copyright is, and that's what your copyrights are. And then there's some additional links that are just of interest if you wanted to explore these further. There's a really good resource from the Columbia University Copyright Advisory Office that goes really in depth into copyright, and you can go ahead and take a look at that. In fact, a lot of my materials are based on their materials, and of course I've asked permission, so that everything is compliant, okay? Something that's interesting, if you ever have time, is to actually look at fair use cases that have made their way to the Supreme Court and actually listen or follow along and see how they made their decisions on whether something was compliant with copyright. Okay, and then there's also the Copyright Crash Course, which is a web-based resource where you can go in and learn more about copyright. But today, what I really want to do, the big chunk of the content involves the center of your screen right now, the center of this LibGuide, and that discusses the framework that we use to analyze a copyright use. So what I'd like you to do in your head is start out by thinking about some information that you plan to use. So think about the thing, the copyrighted item that you might use at some point. And then you also want to think specifically about how you plan to use it. You have to have both those pieces in mind. You have to have a copyrighted thing, and then you have to be thinking about how you plan to use it, okay? For example, you might be wanting to show a video in a classroom. So there's the video is your thing, and then your use of it will be showing it in a classroom. Maybe you want to share a photo on a website or a blog that you have, okay? That's something that you can use in a certain way. Perhaps you want to share a meme or a GIF on social media. So maybe you have a Tumblr page and you want to share a meme on your Tumblr page. That's something that you might consider thinking about today. You might want to share a link in an email. You might even be thinking about getting a tattoo based on an artwork. Okay, we've actually had some really great conversations about copyright and tattoos. Okay. So these are all examples of how you might have a thing and use it in a certain way, okay? Now what we would like to do is go over this framework, and there's 5 questions, and it really is essential that you answer these 5 questions in order. What we find in the library is that people who come in and ask us questions about, you know, is this going to be a compliant use of this copyrighted item? Everybody wants to skip to fair use, okay? For some reason, that's like the most exciting part of copyright is fair use. But I'd say half of the time we don't even have to consider fair use because if you follow the framework, there's other reasons why you might be able to use something compliantly. So you want to go through these 5 questions and you want to do them in order, okay? So there's a reason why they're in the order that they are, okay? So the first question that you see in this framework is the work protected by copyright? You have to answer that question first because if it's not even covered by copyright, then you don't have to worry about it. You can use it however you want. But there's some specific questions that you can ask to determine is the work protected by copyright, okay? So the first item is, do you own the copyright? A lot of our faculty and our students actually own copyrighted materials. If you've ever written something, if you've ever drawn something, if you've ever taken a photograph, you own the copyright of those materials, okay? And it's not like you have to have it registered at the Copyright Office. Just by taking the photograph and having it on your phone, you own the copyright for that item, okay? For example, right now we are in the throes of Wayne Essence submissions, so all kinds of faculty and students are turning in items for our literary magazine here at Wayne College called Wayne Essence. When you turn in those materials, you still retain the copyright for all of those materials that you're turning in. However, by signing the form, your submission form, you're allowing the Wayne Essence group to actually make copies and distribute it on your behalf. But you're still going to retain the rights to all of that creative material, okay? Now, do you own the copyright? You'll see my note there that says, do you really? It can get complicated because sometimes if you publish a book, and in my case, many years ago, I co-authored a book on library services to homeschooled teenagers. It turns out I did not own the copyright of my own book. The publisher did. So if somebody wanted to make copies of a part of my book, they didn't contact me. They had to contact the publisher, and then they would deal with all of that. So sometimes the publisher retains the rights to books and chapters in books. Okay. Something else that we have to sometimes worry about, especially in higher education, is a work for hire, that by working for a company or a corporation or an institution, the employer might retain rights for things that you create while you work there. So that's something that you need to check into as well. And keep in mind, students have rights too. So if they're writing a research paper, they have copyrights to that research paper. Okay. And then beware, if you find something on a website, sometimes it's hard to determine who the copyright owner actually is, because on the internet, pretty much anything goes, unfortunately, and people post things and you would assume that the website is the copyright owner, but a lot of times it's not. And sometimes it's really difficult to determine the actual copyright holder of something that you find on a public website. Now, the other piece of this, beyond whether or not you own the copyright, is to determine if something is in the public domain. If something is in the public domain, it's not covered by copyright, and you can use it however you wish. Some of the situations where something might be in the public domain is that the copyright holder has willingly given up all rights. So, for example, materials that are being prepared as an open educational resource or an open textbook, those are intended and created to be shared freely, and there is no copyright that covers that. Now, sometimes they'll want attribution if you use the materials, but for the most part, open educational resources are not covered by copyright. Items that are published by the federal government are actually not covered by copyright, okay? But keep in mind that sometimes there will be materials or research studies that are published on a government website that there are retained copyright owners. So just read those materials very carefully. And also another piece of this is that slogans, emblems, logos are covered by trademark, which is a whole other ball of law, okay? So that's not actually copyrighted, that's trademark law. An example of this would be NASA. Their logo is actually copyright, or is trademarked, I'm sorry. So you can't use the NASA logo without asking permission, even though it's a government entity. Okay. Now, some things go into the public domain when their copyright expires. If you remember that one of the pieces of copyright law, it requires that all rights expire at some point, okay? So at some point on January 1st of every year, we call that Public Domain Day, because every year new materials get put into the public domain that people can use freely, which is always a fun day to see what, what's in the public domain on January 1st. Now, there are some tools that will help you determine if something is in the public domain. I have a link here to this digital copyright slider, and I opened it up on my screen. Hopefully you can see it. It's a little complicated because copyright law has changed so often over the years that it's really hard to determine. So if you take a look up on my screen, I have a number of situations, and you just look at the publication date, and you move the slider, and then you see how the information changes in the little windows on the left. So right now, if something was published before 1923, in the window it says no permission is needed. It's in the public domain. And then you can just move the arrow, and you'll see the little words are changing to either yes, no, or maybe, and then it gives you an explanation in the box. Okay, so that copyright slider is helpful, although complicated. But it's helped me a couple times determine if something is actually in the public domain. Okay, so that's just question one, but your copyright use actually might be covered by that. So if you own an image, then you could do whatever you want with it, okay? If you determine that it is actually protected by copyright, then you move on to question two. Okay, now this is the one that really applies here at the college or at other schools, and you're going to ask yourself, is there a specific exception to the law that covers my use? And the big one that we talk about here at Wayne College is this classroom use exception. This is an exception to copyright law that allows you to use copyrighted materials in certain situations in a classroom. It has to meet all of these criteria, though, and this is where it gets a little sticky, because sometimes we don't like it when it doesn't meet one of these, but this is really the exception to copyright law. It has to be in a classroom. Actually in a live classroom, not anywhere else in the school, not in the hallway, not in the library, not in the auditorium. It has to be in a classroom. Okay. Now, some people have been very loose with what they define a classroom. For example, if you take your class out into the courtyard, is that now a classroom? It could be, but that's up to you to determine, but really the law says it should be in a classroom. And here's the one that is the stickler. It has to be in person, engaged in face-to-face instruction. So online or distance education, what we're doing right now, web conferencing, is not covered in this classroom use exception. Now there's another exception down here called the TEACH Act, which does cover that. But for the classroom use exception, it has to be face-to-face instruction in a classroom. It has to be at a nonprofit educational institution, so not at any for-profit school. So if they charge you at a for-profit school, that does not apply. Or, for example, if it's like a continuing education kind of course, the classroom use exception does not apply here. You have to be using a legitimately, legally acquired copy, okay? So it can't be something that you downloaded off of the internet without getting permission. It has to be like a purchased copy of like a DVD. Right here is where we're getting into an issue with people wanting to use Netflix in the classroom. That would probably violate this piece of it, because Netflix, when you show a streamed video from a service like that, when you sign up, you actually sign an agreement that says that you're going to use it for home use only, okay? So technically, if you're using Amazon Prime or Netflix streamed materials in your classroom, you are no longer under this classroom use exception. And then finally, it has to be performed or displayed only, not handed out. So photocopies from a chapter of a book is not allowed. If you burn a CD with a bunch of music and hand it out to your class, that does not count. It can only be performed or displayed. So you can show a movie in your classroom. You can display a book on an overhead projector, that type of stuff, but you can't actually hand it out or distribute it in any way. So that's the classroom use exception, which covers a lot of territory in our day-to-day world here at the college, okay? That covers a lot of use, okay? The other piece here is the TEACH Act, which does cover distance online education. I'm not going to go into details now, but there is a checklist here. For example, if you're using a Brightspace Classroom to distribute materials and things like that, to share videos, stream music or something like that, there's a checklist here. For example, you have to be able to authenticate the people who are in the classroom, so only the people who have paid for the classroom would have access to it. So there's a lot of stipulations there that do cover distance and online education like I'm doing today, okay, like a web conference. So that's question 2. I'd say 95% of the questions that I get here in the library from faculty and students might be covered by the classroom use exception, okay? Next is question 3. So far we would be answering no to questions 1 and 2, and then we're going to go ahead and move on to question 3 to see, is there a license that covers my use? And some examples of this would be if, for example, the library purchased a DVD that came with public performance rights. Sometimes the library can pay for like a National Geographic film that allows us to publicly play a DVD like in the hallway or something like that, or in the auditorium. So there may be a license that allows you to do public performance of certain works. Sometimes, I'm trying to think of another example here. For example, on campus last summer they showed Wonder Woman outside here on the campus. And what they did is they just actually paid for the rights. So they paid for the rental to be able to show that publicly. So just because somebody's showing a movie in the courtyard or something like that doesn't necessarily mean that they're violating copyright, but just make sure if you plan to do that, that you're following the license that would allow you to do that. Now, there is a huge movement right now with Creative Commons licenses. And if you follow this link that I provide in my guide, it will go into great detail about what a Creative Commons license is. But basically, it allows content creators to allow a certain amount of use that you decide for your item. So let's say I wrote a book and I wanted to put it online. I can choose a Creative Commons license that allows people to use it, distribute it, do whatever I want them to do with it. However, I might say, but you have to attribute me if you do that. So there's a lot of ways that you can share your materials, make it more accessible, make it more compliant to other people to use, but you can decide how much you want to do. You can even give up all your rights if you want to by using one of those Creative Commons licenses. Okay, I'm going to take a moment here and take a peek over at my chat box and see if anything's going on there. I don't think so. I think everybody seems to be doing okay. If you have questions, you can pop them into the chat box. Now, under this question 3, there are ways that you can go about looking for more permissive type materials. So let's say you wanted to use an item and you weren't really set on a specific item. For example, in my work with the Lions Club, I do the newsletter for the Lions Club in Massillon. And so what I can do, if I wanted to find a picture, I can actually look for a more permissive picture based on these Creative Commons licenses. Now you can use my link to Permissive Media that lists a bunch of places. For example, there's a website called Pixabay that allows you to use a lot of their images for non-commercial reasons. I love that. They have really professional photography that you can use. Or you can use the Google Advanced Image Search. And I'm going to just switch my screen here, so hold on one second. Okay. So this is the advanced image search that you have in Google, and if you wanted to, you can just Google advanced image search, and then it'll come up with a screen for you. But at the bottom of the page, you'll see that they let you search by usage rights. So let's say if I wanted a picture of like a lion cub, okay, that's what I'm looking for. And then down here at the bottom of the page, I can change it that So I want an image that I'm free to use, share, or modify. So maybe I want to put a St. Patrick's Day hat on a Lions cover, something like that. So I can go ahead and perform a search looking for permissive pictures. So here are a number of pictures that I can choose from that would allow me to use it in that way. Okay, so you can actually look for materials that are more permissive and that a Creative Commons allows you to use it however you want. Now, if I was going to use it commercially, then I'd have to make sure that I chose that in the search, because that was another option in the Google search. Okay, so just keep in mind, though, once you start searching, always make sure to go back to that advanced search and don't fall into the rabbit hole of, okay, so I clicked on this image, and then I'm going to click on another image, and then I'm going to get deeper into my search. Those further images that I find may not be covered by the Creative Commons. Okay, and I have a question from Elizabeth. Can you do these permissive searches on any browser? Sure, yeah, go ahead, any way that you get to Google. So if you're using your iPad, if you're using Chrome, just go to the advanced Google image search and then use the drop down. So that's a really good question. Okay, I'm going to go back to my LibGuide here. Okay, so the question here is there a license that covers my use? Check Creative Commons, check the item itself, and see if it allows you to use it how you want to use it. Okay? And then, not finally, but this is kind of why we're here today with this Fair Use Week, but we have this question for, is my use covered by fair use? Now you can see that there might be reasons why you already can use it before you even get to this question. That's why we kind of want to wait for that. So here we are at fair use. Is it covered by fair use? And let's just talk about what that means. Fair use is a way that will allow you to use materials, copyrighted materials, in a way that would be considered fair to the copyright creator. Now, it's important to note that fair use is not a compliant use. Okay, there's a difference. You're actually recognizing that some uses are in fact infringements to copyright law, but they're considered fair infringements. So it's like, that's okay. You know, nobody's going to come after you. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it's a way to think about how to use copyrighted materials in a way that isn't going to be a detriment to the copyright creator. Okay? Now, for something to be covered by this fair use idea, it has to meet, or you have to consider these 4 factors. Okay, so think about the item and think about how you're going to use it. You first have to think about the purpose and the character of how you're going to use it, including whether or not it's a commercial use, or if you're using it like for nonprofit educational reasons like a research paper. Okay, so you have to think about the purpose. You have to think about the nature of the copyrighted work. For example, if it's a highly creative item, like music or a novel, a poem, highly creative things are not necessarily as easy to get away with fair use as, say, like a nonfiction work or more factual, data-driven information. Okay, so the nature of the work you have to consider, the amount and how substantial of the portion that you used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So how much of it are you using? Are you using a clip? Are you using the whole thing? Okay, that you have to consider that. And then the final piece is the effect of the use upon the potential market or for the value of the copyrighted work. So really, are you getting in the way of the copyright holder of making money? Okay, are you making any money? Even if you're not, you could be keeping them from making money. So you want to keep these 4 things in mind. Now that list by itself, not that useful. Okay, that really doesn't help us clarify anything. But if we go to this fair use checklist, there's a hyperlink on the LibGuide. You can look at the checklist, and this will walk you through some examples. So, and we do recommend that you actually physically walk through a checklist if you're going to be considering something under the fair use statute. Okay. Now, on one side of the checklist, it lists things that you can check that would favor fair use. On the right side, those are things, if you check those are opposing fair use. And you'll see that there's a section for purpose, nature, amount, and effect. You want to go through and check everything that applies to your use. And then in the end, you're going to evaluate that and make a decision for yourself. Okay, but just keep in mind, your use, if you're using fair use, is still considered an infringement to copyright. Okay, fair use is simply a defense of your use of somebody else's materials. So if you use something and claim that it's fair use, the copyright holder still has the right to come after you and sue you or send you a cease and desist letter, but at least you have something to say, well, this is why I used it and this is why we would consider this a fair use. Okay, so use fair use carefully, thoughtfully, and document it. Okay, and keep this. You fill out this checklist and you keep it in a drawer, just in case somebody wants to question your use someday. So basically, if you go through the fair use checklist, you'll go through, am I using it for teaching, research, scholarship? I'm at a nonprofit educational institution. I'm using it for criticism or comment. News reporting, that's how journalists are able to use clips from sports and stuff like that, because news reporting is a fair use. Am I using it in a transformative way? Okay, so that's different from a derivative, but are you transforming it into something new, something with new usefulness? Okay. Is it like behind a login? Is it restricted access? For example, if you're in a Brightspace classroom, are you using it for parody? Okay, now parody is something interesting. Parody, if we're going to look at the definition, really it's an imitation of a style of a writer or an artist or a performer that's a deliberate exaggeration for comedic effect. Okay, we cannot confuse parody with satire, which is slightly different. And let me look at my notes here really quick. So satire is a use of irony, sarcasm, in exposing, denouncing, or deriding vice or folly. So for example, something that appears on The Onion, that's considered satire, not parody. A Weird Al song is a parody. Okay, so if you are doing a true parody, that falls under fair use. Okay, now things that oppose fair use under purpose, anything commercial, if you're going to profit from the use in any way, if it's just for entertainment, you're actually bad faith behavior, which means you are intentionally using somebody's copyrighted material and denying them credit. Those are things that if you check those boxes, then it's probably leaning towards not being a fair use. When you're looking at the nature, is it published? Is it factual or nonfiction? Is it really important to your educational objectives? So this is important in the classroom, like it's really tied to one of your student learning outcomes. Those tend to favor fair use. But if it's out of an unpublished work, or perhaps a highly creative work, like I mentioned, art or poetry or fiction, then it tends to be opposing fair use. Amount, a lot of copyright infringements, the legality of it always falls onto the amount. You want to make sure that you're just using a small quantity, not a lot of it. And here's the most important piece. The portion used is not central or significant to the entire work. So it can't be like the most important part. Okay? Now how you define that is up to you, but there are times where that is what, at the Supreme Court level, decided whether it was a fair use or not, was how much and how important it was. And then, is the amount appropriate for what you're trying to do? So if you're just trying to show your class some special effects, like in the Lord of the Rings, like maybe you're studying CGI or something like that, it's not essential for you to show the whole movie. Maybe you just pick out a couple clips, okay? And then that would be an appropriate amount for that educational purpose. So opposing fair use would be a large portion. The portion is central to, or the heart of the work. Finally, the effect that has to do with like depriving the copyright holder of income. So you got to make sure that you're using a lawfully purchased or acquired piece of the original work. One or only a few copies are made. No significant effect on the market. Okay, no similar product marketed by the copyright holder. So like if you can buy it from the copyright holder, we suggest that you just do that if you want to use it. Lack of a licensing mechanism, so you were not able to obtain an actual license to use it in the way you wanted to use it. There's a lot opposing fair use under effect. So if it replaces the sale of the copyrighted work, like if you make an entire photocopy of a book, yeah, you just replace the sale of a copyrighted work. It will significantly impair the market or potential market of the actual original or derivative work. If there's reasonable available licensing mechanism, for example, a major motion picture, all you have to do is call Swank to have a public performance. So there is a legitimate way to actually show a movie. And that also goes to affordable permission available. If you make numerous copies, that's not allowed. If you make it accessible on the web or in some other public forum, and then if you repeat it or long-term use. So for example, if you use a chapter out of a book every semester in your Brightspace classroom, that would probably oppose fair use. After the first use, you really do need to pay licensing to be able to use that material. Okay, so I'm going to take a deep breath here because that was a lot, okay? This all covers fair use, and you can see why a lot of people talk about this, because there's a lot of gray area here. And I do recommend that you talk to somebody if you're trying to make these decisions. Talk it out with somebody, and you're always welcome to come in and talk to the library staff, okay? And we'll help you work through some of this. We'll give you our opinion, but again, we're not lawyers. We can just tell you what we think about it, and then you'd have to make your own decision. Okay, so I'm back to my questions and the framework. And so, is my use covered by fair use? If you determine that no, really this doesn't seem like fair use, I want to use more than the appropriate amount, or maybe I want to use it to make money or do a fundraiser or something like that, you might find that no, it's not fair use. Then you have to go down to question 5. Do I need permission from the copyright owner? If that's the case, then you need to reach out to the copyright owner, whether it's a publisher, whether it's a website, and actually try and get permission. Sometimes all you have to do is write a letter and ask permission. For example, I said a lot of my materials I used from Columbia University's Copyright Advisory Office. Well, I just reached out to them and asked them, and they said, sure, just as long as you give me credit, and so you'll see my sample letter here where I asked for permission, and permission was granted to use their fair use checklist. Okay, and then the last piece of that is that sometimes you just got to pay. If you want to use something, sometimes you have to pay for it, and there is a resource here called the Copyright Clearance Center, and that's a resource that we would use here in the library if we were going to, say, put an item on reserve that we have to pay for the rights to do that. Okay, so at this point, I just walked through those 5 questions, and I want to give you a couple examples to think about, and then I'm going to, let's see, I've got a question up here. So there's a question, if the book is not available yet in the bookstore, is it appropriate to make copies of some chapters? And that actually happens a lot here at campus. So the bookstore is out of it, and it's the first week of class, you don't want your students to get behind. Yes, you just have to determine under the fair use checklist, probably the piece you want to pay attention to would be the piece about the amount. Okay, so if it's like a, there are some guidelines that we use here in the library. They're not law, they're simply guidelines. So if it's a book that has 15 chapters and you want to use 1 chapter and provide that to your students, that might fall under the amount as being under fair use. Okay. It also has to do with how much time it would take to get the license to be able to do that or get copyright approval. So probably a chapter would be appropriate to provide your students while the book is coming in. If that's not the case, then let's say it's 3 weeks into the semester, you might have to switch around your syllabi to kind of figure out if you can cover something else while their books are waiting to come in at the bookstore. And what you could do is have people share the same book. So if you have one person in the class who has a book, they can read the chapter and then lend it to somebody else in the class to read it. It's the actual copying and the distribution that would be the main sticking points for copyright violations. But that was a very good question. It comes up a lot, unfortunately. Okay, let's see here. Okay, well, that's like a lot of content, but let's just kind of think of more fun things, okay, like actual examples of how this might apply in our daily lives. So I kind of have this scenario that I want to work through, and if you have questions while I'm going over this, go ahead and pop them in the chat room. And so here's a scenario which is kind of timely, and you'll see why it's timely here in a moment. But let's pretend that I'm a language arts teacher at junior high. So let's say I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, okay? And I grew up in the 80s, and when I was younger, I was profoundly affected by the book The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. So any other people who love The Outsiders, give me a shout out in the chat. I mean, that was just like such an incredible book for me at that age, okay? And then that was only reinforced when the movie for The Outsiders came out in 1983. So I was one of those teenagers who was obsessed with Pony Boy and Soda Pop and all those characters when the movie came out as well. And if anybody's curious, you can always go out and see The Outsiders. It came out in 1983, and you could actually go and see Tom Cruise before he got his teeth fixed. So anyway, so that's a great movie, but let's just say, you know, that's just something that was important to you, and as a language arts teacher, you wanted to put together some kind of curriculum in your 7th grade language arts class for your students, okay? So let's say with my students, I wanted to not only read the book, so I'm going to assign them all to read books, and I'll probably buy copies of the books for them, okay? So I'm really not infringing on S.E. Hinton's rights to copyright because I'm actually purchasing the books, okay? And I'm going to have my students read the books, and we'll talk about it. And then later in the semester, or later in the year, we're going to go ahead and watch the movie together, okay? But since I'm in a face-to-face classroom, so that would be under question 2, is there a specific exception in the law that covers my use? So by showing that movie, using a classroom use exception, that would actually be copyright compliant, okay? So showing the movie is cool. Now, of course, I don't want to make copies of the movie for everybody. That would be an infringement, okay? Well, let's say we take it a little bit further, and there's a language arts club at the school, and they're as obsessed as I am about the book and the movie, and they want to make T-shirts. Okay, they want to make T-shirts for a fundraiser, sell them, and make money for the Language Arts Club. And this is all going to tie into a very important poem that's featured in the movie and in the book, Robert Frost's poem, Nothing Gold Can Stay. And here I'm going to put something up here on the screen for you guys to look at and consider. Let me see here. Let's say that we design this T-shirt. Okay, and we want to use this for a fundraiser. And a very important part of the book is when they say, "Stay gold, Pony Boy," and then there's the text of the poem that's been put on the T-shirt. Okay, so there's a lot of different components here that you got to consider. When did that poem come out? So that's a poem by Robert Frost. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use that or not. Okay, so if I'm going to walk through, I'm going to go ahead and walk through these questions. Is the work protected by copyright? And right now I'm just talking about the words from the poem that I want to put on the T-shirt and sell. Okay, if I skip to fair use, okay, if I skip ahead and say, oh, is this a fair use, putting it on the T-shirts, as soon as I hit that fundraiser, it's not a fair use anymore, right? However, if I start with this first question, is the work protected by copyright, and walk through, you know, what's in the public domain, I might determine that the poem is actually in the public domain, which in fact on January 1st of this year, this poem entered the public domain because it was published in 1923. So my use of that T-shirt is actually a fair use, and we can use it however we want. We can make bookmarks, we can make posters, we can sell T-shirts, because this poem is actually in the public domain. Now on the back of the T-shirt, if I wanted to change it from Stay Gold, which is referring to the poem by Robert Frost, which is in the public domain, and I decided to put Stay Gold Pony Boy, Okay, that's referring back to the book which was published in 1967, which is not in the public domain. Then I would have to consider fair use. Then I would have to consider, is that the most important phrase from the book The Outsiders? Some would argue that it is. Okay, so that might make this maybe not copyright compliant. Okay? So that's just one example. I used to use this example with education students a few years ago, and part of their work was to determine whether or not that poem was in the public domain. They're like, oh, no, it's not, so you can't use it. But as of this year, you actually can. So that was kind of a neat thing that I discovered this year. Okay, so that's just one scenario, and it kind of has multiple facets. And if you guys have any questions about specific scenarios, go ahead and pop those in the chat box. Some other things to consider, especially for our students, the use of memes. Okay, so we all love a meme, right? Here, let me pop one up here on the screen here. Okay, so here's a meme. Here's a picture of a cat, and it says, I'm in your computer stealing all your selfies. Okay, so memes are meant to be entertaining. Some of them could be parody. Okay, some of them could be have permission, okay? But you really do need to think about all the components of a meme. Not only do you have a picture that could be copyrighted, but you also have words and catchphrases and things like that that might be trademarked. So you have to be really careful with memes. Now, we all love GIFs and memes, and we all share them. However, where you share them is something to consider, because as soon as you get into a more commercial use, you have to be very careful. There's an example. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the socially awkward penguin meme. This one actually went to litigation, okay? There is a picture of a penguin that you can post your words around. A lot of people were using it. It's been shared so many times. But it turns out that the original image that was used was from Getty Images, and it was a National Geographic photographer who took the picture of this penguin, and that somebody went ahead and illustrated and used it in a meme. And it turns out that as soon as it was posted on a public blog, which of course often generates revenue, they were able to send them a cease and desist letter and then also charge them $900. Okay, and that's actually probably a cheap one. So just be aware that your use of images can be a violation. You can get a cease and desist letter, and you can be forced to take it down, and you can be forced to pay. Okay, so that's just something to consider. Now, the picture that I'm showing you, which I was very careful to choose since we are in a webinar, is a picture of my own cat. Okay, so I would encourage you to be creative. I would encourage you to take your own pictures, create your own memes, your own GIFs, images, videos, things like that, and use your own content, and then you'll be 100% sure that you're allowed to use it, and nobody's going to come after you for that. Okay, does anybody have any examples that you want to talk about? We've got like 10 minutes left of this webinar, so I would love to hear some of yours. Let's see, so I have one here that says, what happens if you cannot reach the owner of a picture, meme, or GIF when trying to request their permission? You have to really try. Okay, so when it comes to trying to determine if you can have permission, you have to document how you tried to get copyright permission. So I would just keep some notes that you reached out on the website, you did your research, you sent 3 letters asking permission and never heard back, and then you would document that as a way that you could use it. I mean, ideally, you would be able to research and find the owner and ask permission and get it or be denied. But now, if we're just talking about social media in general, so let's say you're on Facebook or Instagram and your account is not monetized in any way. Okay, so there's a lot of people on Instagram who actually make money from the content that they post. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your average user like you or me who are sharing memes and things like that those ways. I mean, those are legitimate fair uses of the items. But as soon as you put it on a blog, or as soon as you put it on a Tumblr or some kind of monetized website, that really dips into the other side of fair use and makes it really not a fair use. Okay, so for our a socially awkward penguin example, that was on an unmonetized blog, so they really had to take it down and pay okay? So you have to try, or at least before you share something, think about it and see if you think it's something that would be really violating copyright. I really don't want to discourage you guys from sharing stuff, but just be thoughtful about it, and especially if you are in a situation where you have a more monetized presence online, to be very careful. And when in doubt, you know, really use your own creative work. I mean, that's the best thing. Any other questions? I would encourage people to avoid big companies like Disney, Marvel. Those companies have a lot of money to throw behind litigation. So back in the day, and I'm going back like 20 years, maybe even longer, where there was a string of like daycares that had Disney characters painted up on the walls. They had to paint over them because they had cease and desist letters delivered from Disney. So Disney is probably one of the big ones to avoid if you can. So nobody's curious about tattoos. That seems like a big one. Any other questions? Okay. Well, just here in the last few minutes, let's just go over. Oh, so somebody just did post. What about tattoos? Okay, so if you're going to tattoo something on your body that's very permanent, look into the copyright of the image. It's probably best to ask somebody to design something, or if you have a tattoo artist, usually they have their own designs that you can choose from. But for example, if you want to put Yoda on your shin, okay, you might want to either make sure that it's transformative in some way or a parody in some way, because that's such a permanent thing that it really is. If you tattoo somebody else's artwork on your body, that is a copyright infringement. Now, the chances of somebody seeing that and doing something about it are pretty low, but just keep in mind that art is art and it is protected by copyright. I knew somebody was interested in tattoos. Everybody's talking about them. Okay, so I'm going to remind you guys in the last few minutes that you could always come back to this LibGuide, okay, and I'll keep it updated, so if there's any new information, because you know laws are changing all the time, it will be posted here, and I encourage you to explore, for example, the permissive media tab here that lists websites like Pixabay that I mentioned earlier, that you can find resources, things that you can use with a clear conscience because you know that people have given you permission to do that. So stick to those types of things. And when in doubt, attribute everything, okay? So you can always give credit, cite your sources, make sure that you're not passing something off as your own if it belongs to somebody else, okay?